Welcome back to Doctrines 1. Again, I'm your teacher, Dr. Benjamin Olson. As we continue our discussion in theology proper, we're going to continue our discussion about the essence of God. We've talked about how He is the simplicity of His essence, the unity of His essence, the actuality of His essence, the independence of His essence. But let's look about the immutability of His essence. Again, God, because He does not is not divided, He is unique, He is simple, He is also immutable. He does not change over time. In other words, I can't think of God today as different than God was at another time. This actually is also derived from His self-existence and His independence. Because He's not dependent upon anything else for His existence, He isn't dependent upon time for His existence. By the way, change is that time is measured by simply a measure of the change in things, right? We see things change over time. Immutability means that God is free from all change within His essence, attributes, eternal purposes, and unconditional promises. God cannot change. The immutability of God is because God is absolute perfection. He doesn't need to change. He doesn't need to grow. He doesn't need to learn. He doesn't need, because He doesn't need anything. So you see how all of these attributes relate to one another. He is absolute perfection. So what immutability does not mean, though, is that immutability of God is not immobility or inaction. For God is active and enters into relationships with changing men, which means that there are times when that God seems to change His mind, and yet it's not because God changed, but because the condition changed. So his actions, because they're reflecting an unchanging character, His actions change because the circumstances change. In His dealings with changing man, it is necessary for an unchangeable God to change in His dealings with changing men in order to remain unchangeable in His character and purposes. So we see change from our perspective, but that's because the change is in us, or the change is in mankind, or in history. In other words, God, Numbers 23, God cannot repent. His dealings with mankind changes when man changes from evil to good, or good to evil. In other words, Jonah 3, when God seems to relent from His decision to destroy Nineveh, it's not because God changed, it's because the circumstances on the ground changed. Or when we see in Genesis 6, when He regrets that He made man, not because God changed, God is still holy, but because man had completely messed up everything, and now God was going to deal with mankind differently. All right, the next is the impassibility of God's essence. This is, again, related to the fact that He does not change. His disposition cannot change. The way that He relates to man is unchanging in that His character doesn't change. Again, doesn't mean that He doesn't do things differently because circumstances change, like Jonah, where He relents from destroying Nineveh, or in Genesis 6, where He regrets making man. That regret is not a change in His essence, but rather a change in how He's dealing with man, who is the actual change. Something changed in man, and so God is going to deal with it differently because His character, which is unchanging, dictates to do so. All right, so God's disposition, in other words, God always hates sin, right? So if mankind sins, He's going to hate that sin. If mankind relents from that sin, repents from that sin, then God will have grace, and He will react to that faith. God is not subject to passions. And here's what impassibility really means, is that God does not, unlike the number of pantheons and mythological gods, which are fashioned after mankind, God is not subject to His own passions. Mankind's passions are fleeting. We are fickle beings. But God instead is unchanging in His person, His character, His nature. And so when circumstances change, yes, His actions change or his reactions change to mankind, but they do not change his character, right? And so notice, though, that this does not mean that God does not feel or have emotion. Right? God does have emotion. God does feel. We see this many times in Scripture. Jesus Christ, the personification of God in human flesh, obviously has emotions. Those emotions are not simply because he's man, but rather because he is God. This means that God is not, but instead it means that God is not subject to his emotions. Right? He doesn't change things because he's feeling passion. In other words, God doesn't get angry and do something out of his anger. God doesn't do something differently because he's feeling something external to himself. You say, well, what about the time on Mount Sinai when God was angry with Israel, and then Moses simply got God to relent of that anger? Well, here's the deal. First and foremost, God's character is not what's in question here, but rather his dealings with Israel was what was in question. Okay, his anger was toward the sin. His anger didn't change, right? His disposition toward the sin doesn't change, but instead, what God is doing is really more for Moses' sake than it is for God's own sake. To think that Moses somehow is talking God down off the ledge is then to make Moses somehow higher or greater than God, and that is certainly not what is intended in that passage. But rather, it's Moses who learns. It's Moses who changes. It's Moses who was originally the one who was frustrated with Israel, and God comes to him, and almost in a I would almost think this more in a child psychology or a reverse psychology, where God says, all right, fine, let's deal with them. Let's do away with them, and gets Moses to change his mind. And again, that's what God is doing. He's bringing that change out in Moses, where Moses recognizes, no, this wouldn't be good if God just simply did away with this people group, because it would reflect badly on God. All right. So then let's get into the infinity of God's essence. God is infinite. The infinity of God means that he does not have or possess any limitations. No limitations on God's essence. He is free from all limitations. He is bound, only by his own nature, his own character. In other words, God cannot sin, God cannot deny himself, God cannot cease to be God, but he is limitless within his own nature. When infinity is related to time, God is said to be eternal. Of course, he is actually outside of time. Time is a construct to him because he is singular in his essence. When it relates to time, he doesn't go through time with us. In other words, we are time-bound creatures. I can only go forward in time on a 1 minute to 1 minute basis. But God is not bound by time. God is in the end, he is in the beginning, and is unchanging through that time because he stands outside of time, as it were. He is without beginning, he is without end. He is free from all succession of time or time units. He is, in fact, is the cause of time. To God, there is no past, present, or future. It's all existent in one eternal present of himself. Infinity of God, when it relates to space, though, we might use the term immensity or omnipresence, that he is not limited by space. In fact, God fills the entirety of the universe, the observable universe, again, is an object in and of itself to him. He is outside of time. He is outside of space. All right, then we have this spirituality of God's essence. God is spirit. That, of course, we see this directly from John 4:24. God is spirit. Notice it does not have an article there. He is not a spirit, but rather he is spirit. This defines God's nature as pure spirit. God, therefore, in his essence, is spirit. This does not. Don't think of this as an ethereal presence or a ghost or an apparition, but rather something that is not substantive, does not have substance, or does not have physical manifestation. He does not have material substance, but rather his substance is itself spirit or spiritual. As spirit, God is not a phantom or non-material essence, but rather he's non-material essence or substance. He's not a spirit in the terms of a ghost or a phantom or a apparition. God is real being with real existence. He is not a mere idea or construct of the mind. We already talked about that with his actuality. As spirit, God is immaterial and he is incorporeal, which means he does not have a physical body. As spirit, spirit does not have flesh or bones. Jesus says this specifically to the disciples, as a spirit would not have flesh or bones, as you see that I have, because he was resurrected. The command which forbids the making of any graven image or likeness of anything is based on the incorporeal nature of God, that he does not have a body. There are, however, expressions of the Bible that represent God as having body parts, but these are what are called anthropomorphisms. They're speaking analogically or metaphorically about God. God's said to have arms. He has hands and eyes, a mouth, face, nostrils, feet, ears. Yet all of those things are speaking analogically or metaphorically about God, that he is, he sees, he does, he acts, he moves, he speaks. All right. And also God is invisible. Deuteronomy 4, Exodus 33, he is invisible. No one has seen God at any time, John 1:18. What about the scriptures that say men saw God? Answer here is what they saw is God's manifestation, not his pure essence. Right? We can see theophanies, what God chooses to reveal about himself through manifestation, but not his pure essence. As spirit, God is a mystery. Not mean mysterious as in unknowable or unknown, but rather that it is something that must be revealed. A mystery is in something that is veiled, that must be unveiled. As a spirit, God has life, or he is alive. He is a living person. He is a living being. God is not an inanimate substance or simply an impersonal force. God is called the living God in 1 Timothy 3:15. All life proceeds from God. Genesis 2, where man, the breath of God gives life to man. As spirit, God has personhood or personality. The definition of personality is that personality involves existence with the power of self-awareness. That God is self-aware of himself in that he is a person. And it means that he has self-determination, that he can make choices of his own. To be self-aware simply means to be aware of oneself among others. Self-awareness is more than mere consciousness. Animals possess a form of consciousness, but not self-awareness. Unlike animals, can relate to feelings, appetites, thoughts to oneself. To be self-determined means to have the ability to look to the future and prepare an intelligent course of action. Self-determined involves the power of choice. Of course, God will talk about the will of God and the providence of God at a later time. Animals also have determination, but not self-determination. That is the power to act from one's own free will rather than simply reacting to external stimuli. Personality involves three elements: intellect, emotion, and will. God has all three elements of personhood. He has intellect, or logos, Psalm 147, Acts 15. God has emotion, or pathos. We see in Psalm 103 that he is emotional or has emotion, but see the impassibility of God that we talked about before. Is not moved by those passions, nor is he constrained by those emotions. And he has volition, or will, or ethos. Daniel 4:35, that he acts according to his own will, and no one can give him counsel. The significance of the personality of God is that it means that man, who is a person, is responsible to and accountable to God, who is also a person. It also means that man, who is a person, can have a relationship with and fellowship with God, who is also a person. That's all we have for the essence of God, or the non-moral or metaphysical attributes of God. In the coming weeks, we'll talk about the Trinity of God. We'll talk about we'll talk about the moral attributes of God at a later time. All right, thank you.